Hello and welcome to this week's Bible study preview. As we're going through the book of Isaiah, we've reached chapters 41 and 42. Your introduction this week, if you have your sheet handy, says, imagine that you were a fan of a team that was playing in the Super Bowl after 2 full weeks of hype and excitement. Normally, here in Cincinnati, that would be purely a hypothetical. This week, though, it's special because Bengals are actually going to play in the Super Bowl this coming Sunday. So, consider this. What goes through your head if you watch them get blown out? What goes through your head if you watch them get crowned as champion? So think through that. What will that be like? Maybe you're watching this after the fact already. I'm recording this on Friday afternoon, full disclosure, and I'm confident the Bengals are going to win. But if they don't, for whatever reason, please don't blame me. I had nothing to do with it. I'm cheering them. I'm on the bandwagon. Hooday, and all that good stuff. But you think through that, if you're really excited for your team and you feel a connection with your team, and here in Cincinnati, certainly there is a lot of feeling of connection with this team. What a surprising run this has been. And you really want them to win. So if they would go and get blown out, there would just be this feeling of being deflated and weakness and disappointment, even though we really had nothing to do with it. It just we placed our confidence in this team, and then our association with this team kind of made us feel humiliated. On the other hand, if you watch your team get crowned champion, it just feels like you were right. You were right to back this team. You maybe even had a hand in it, that you cheered them on to victory, and you watched that trophy presentation if the game's over, the confetti's all coming down, somebody on your team, maybe Mr. Joe Burrow himself, is crowned as Super Bowl MVP, and it just feels like we're on the right team. We're on the right side. And that other team and their fans have to just kind of slink away, their tail between their legs, because they're the losers and we're the winners, and there's a clear contrast here. That is a pretty decent way to start thinking about chapters 41 and 42 of Isaiah, because especially in chapter 41, God is comparing himself to the false gods of the Israelites and the surrounding nations, and essentially calling out the false gods, saying, bring it, come and get some. If you really are real and you're powerful as the nations around Israel and even the Israelites say you are, then you should have no problem kind of stepping up to me. But as you read through chapters 41 and 42, and really all of the prophecy of Isaiah, you see God as this incredibly powerful warrior who also manages to be very tender and compassionate and loving. Lesson objectives for today. First of all, appreciate the power of God, especially when contrasted with the power of idols. Throughout the book of Isaiah, we've seen God use some pretty devastating imagery to highlight just the kind of might that he has and uses in this world, past, present, and future. And this section has more of that. Second one, list at least three reasons for hope in this coming week. And along with this sort of calling out of idols, there are some verses in this section that are incredibly comforting, especially when you realize you're on Team God. Not because you've made a great choice, not because you're an awesome person, but because God chose you. So you're on the winning team. And you get to experience all the things that come along with that victory simply because of God's grace. We won't read all the verses today. It's 2 chapters. It's a lot to cover. Little less than we've been covering in last couple weeks, but still, it's a lot to cover here. So we'll just give you sort of a general idea of what's going on in each section. That first section, Isaiah 41, verses 1 and 2, I think it would be helpful here just to cover our first question, the first activity. So it says, fill in the blanks. The setting imagery for this section is, and we'll just say it, it's a courtroom. You have God saying right off the bat, be silent before me, you islands. And when that term islands is used in, especially in the book of Isaiah, it seems to be referring to nations across the world, especially Gentile nations, nations of people who weren't God's special people. So it's God's reaching out to the ends of the earth and saying, listen up, you are going to hear what I have to say. Come to this courtroom, and we're going to settle this in a very organized, rational way. Who's in charge? Is it your gods or am I in charge? So it's a courtroom setting. The one stirred up from the east. So God says in verse 2, who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service? This is really a reference, one of the few in Isaiah, of a few, to a guy named Cyrus, a guy from Persia, who really was not in power yet at this point. But God, with his knowledge of all time, several times in the book of Isaiah, kind of explains, you're going to go into exile in Babylon. And the Babylonians are going to seem like this fearsome enemy to you, and in a way they are. I'm going to use them as a tool to bring destruction to your land as consequences for walking away from me. But also don't be afraid, because that Babylonian exile will have a time limit to it. It's only going to go a certain amount of time, and then I'm going to bring this guy named Cyrus from Persia, from the east. So you see in this little map here the green Persian Empire. At the time Isaiah was prophesying, Persian Empire wasn't really anything at this point, certainly not a world power. But God is saying, in a short time, this guy Cyrus is going to come from the east, and he's going to take out the Babylonians and send you back to Israel. So one word to describe God in this section is, you can fill in your own blanks there. When I think of God in this section and some of the might he describes in sort of organizing history and the I am he at the end of this section, I think of the interaction God had with Isaiah in our first lesson a couple weeks ago in church. I've always liked this picture. You have Isaiah looking pretty tiny there. You have God seated on a throne, surrounded by fire and cherubim and things like that. And I appreciate that this artist doesn't really try to draw the face of God, because what would you possibly put there? But you just have this sense of majesty and might in Isaiah chapter 6, which we covered a couple weeks ago. Isaiah just, woe is me, I'm going to die, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among this people of unclean lips, and I've seen God face to face. So we have more of that here at the beginning of Isaiah 41. It's just this powerful God who has history so mapped out. And he's telling them, before they're even in Babylonian exile, I'm going to bring you back from it. So a mighty God who turns weapons into dust. Number 2 there, explain the threefold response to the nations called before God. So God calls these Gentile pagan nations in front of him, and their response is pretty useless. And I think we'll go through that today too. The first response is they look at each other and we're going to help each other. So this sort of camaraderie among people who are enemies of God. There's strength in numbers, and they say to each other, be strong. We can do this. We can stand against this God. And then they create idols. And none of that really works. This kind of, we're going to band together and stand against this powerful God, that picture we just looked at, a God like that. It doesn't matter how many human beings you have together. It doesn't matter how many nations you have joined together in some sort of coalition. You just can't stand against a God like this. And it's interesting, too, that God points out that they build the idols. The metalworker encourages the goldsmith. The one who smooths with the hammer spurs on the one who strikes the anvil. One says of the welding, it is good. The other nails down the idol so it will not topple. God is pointing out something that is a great point here, that you put such faith in these idols, and yet what do you need to do so that the idol stands on its own? You got to nail it down. So what kind of powerful gods are these, that you have to create them yourself and then nail them so they stand upright? So God's highlighting sort of the ludicrous nature of trusting in someone that's not him. On to the next section. We'll cover the rest of the sections a little bit less in depth. The next section, Isaiah 41, 8-16, there's some great verses in there that are extremely comforting, and that's activity number 3. It's just pick your favorite verse in this section. So I'd encourage you to have one of those ready if you're going to join us for the Zoom class. I'm partial to fear not, you worm, in verse 14, just the humility there, that I'm just a worm. I'm nothing special. I'm a sinner who deserves nothing from God. And yet God is looking at me, tiny little worm, and saying, don't be afraid. I'm going to take care of it. In fact, I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to buy you back from sin, death, and the devil by sending my son to do that for you. You think of how much you really care about worms. We have a heavy rain here, and then there's a bunch of worms on the sidewalk, and you just try to avoid them, not step on them because it's kind of gross. But you don't really care about them necessarily. But here's God looking down at us and saying, you little worm, you're so small and not very attractive, but don't be afraid, because I love you, little worm, enough that I'm going to die for you. So I appreciate that verse a lot. So this next chapter, or this next section, I should say, sort of stepping away from that courtroom scene, is God's addressing the people of Israel and saying, I've got you. All these other nations that seem like such a threat to you, don't worry, but don't be afraid. I have you in my hand. In fact, he says you're going to be a threshing sledge, which is activity number 4. Threshing sledge is kind of like a plow. This is a drawing of what it may have looked like, but you've got sort of these teeth, metal teeth or stone teeth in the bottom of it. You've got oxen pulling it, and it kind of tears up the land so that you can plant seeds in the ruts, the rivets that this threshing sledge makes. And God tells these poor Israelites, I'm going to make you a threshing sledge. You're going to tear up your enemies, these small little people. And that's an important thing for us to consider today, too, that sometimes it really feels like as Christians we're on the ropes, that there are so many different people who have so many good reasons why Christianity should end or why it's dumb or whatever else, awful things people have to say about Christianity. And God says, I'm going to make you a threshing sledge, not in the sense that we're going to go defeat all these people. That's not really what God says about us as the New Testament church, but just that we're going to be okay, that heaven is waiting for us. That's the final victory. So don't be afraid to stick with God, because things are going to work out in the end. The next section, Isaiah 41:17-29, starts out with this: the poor and needy search for water, but there is none. Their tongues are parched with thirst, but I, the Lord, will answer them. So this last section of chapter 41 begins with kind of a proclamation about the exile. Yeah, things are going to be bad for you, Israel, but I'm going to bring you back. And then there's these images of, I will make rivers flow on barren heights. So question number 5 says, the poor and needy search for water, but there is none. Agree or disagree? The Christian expects things to go poorly, because God tells them ahead of time, it's going to be bad. You're going to look for water and find none. We discussed the same question in the Young Adult Study online last week, and the answers were very interesting. So looking forward to talking through that with you too. Does a Christian expect things to go poorly in life? Number 6, describe the tone in God's challenge to the false gods in verses 21-24. What is your reaction to it? So this chapter concludes, oops, we're going too far here. Chapter concludes essentially with God going back to that courtroom scene and challenging those false gods again, and just giving them this test, just like, hey, false gods, say something. Tell me something about the future. Just really do anything. And so the number 6 on the sheets here just describe the tone of his words here. I think that could be an interesting discussion too. How does God sound here as he's challenging those false gods? Let's see. Next section is the servant of the Lord, Isaiah 42 verses 1-9. This is a great comforting section too, because especially the first 7 verses are speaking about the Messiah and what he'll do. And so you have in chapter 41 this powerful God that's kind of bring it to these false gods, and is in such control and so powerful and challenging those false gods. And then in Isaiah 42, he says, I'm going to send this servant, and it just describes what he's going to do. And it includes verse 3, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, which is a reference to people who are struggling and perhaps weak in their faith. And rather than just crushing them and saying, how dare you not trust me, that Jesus will be patient and tender and compassionate with those people and spend time with them. So activity number 7 is basically walking through some of the things we learn about that servant, that messianic servant in chapter 42, and just trying to match up an event with Jesus' life. First one we'll just do together. So God says, I will put my spirit on him, on this servant. And I think we could really highlight Jesus' baptism as a fulfillment of that promise, in which the Holy Spirit actually descended upon Jesus in the form of a dove. So he is that servant being prophesied here, the one who will do amazing miracles, as it says here, which we'll talk about in our Zoom class, who has such power, but is also so tender to that bruised reed and that smoldering wick. 2 more sections. Song of praise to the Lord, Isaiah 42, 10-17. Sing to the Lord a new song. So you have, look at activity number 8 on your sheet. Choose one image from the list below. So it says the whole earth is filled with praise for God. So that's one image. In verse 13, you have God marching out like a champion, like a warrior. So again, here's one of those images of power, another metaphor in which God is kind of challenging anyone who would step up to him and saying, you can't take me down, and I will defend my people. And then God transforming the landscape after holding back for a time. So twice in these 2 chapters we get this imagery of God taking a dry, useless land where no one could live and nothing can grow, and just transforming it over time, which is a picture of the restoration he would give. You could say the return from exile is a partial fulfillment of this. You could say the growth of the church all over the world, especially in the New Testament, is partial fulfillment of this. But ultimately, this is about heaven, which is, again, there's so much comfort in this section. The beautiful imagery What once was barren and hopeless is now a beautiful landscape, and we get to enjoy that here on this earth, for sure, with the promises that God makes and how He can take sort of a barren life and bring blessing out of it. Vicar Brown has a great sermon from the prophet Jeremiah this weekend, and that concept of finding joy and beauty even in a world of hard things is central to his sermon theme. So looking forward to hearing that, and you hearing that too. So this second to last section here just really describes all the good things that God is going to do. And then the last section that's titled Israel Blind and Deaf. Activity number 9 says, describe why this section is so jarring after what we've studied so far. You can read it on your own, but after all this positivity and God saying, here's what I'm going to do to protect you, chapter 42 ends with God sort of giving Israel a stinging rebuke and saying, you people are blind and deaf. I've done all these things. I'm going to do all these things for you, but you refuse to see them, and you refuse to listen to my warnings or hear my promises. So we have at a bookend of these promises just another reminder to Israel, like, guys, I'm doing my best here. God is saying to them, I'm reaching out to you, pulling out all the stops. I'm sending you prophets. I'm doing miracles. I'm saving you from your enemies. Please, please, please open your eyes, open your ears, and listen to me. But sadly, we know that many of them did not. So ends on sort of a sad note, but for us, some of the takeaways for this section are just the great images, great verses of promise and hope, especially beginning chapter 42, this messianic servant who will be so powerful and so loving. Some things for us to take hope from this lesson for the coming week. So I hope you're able to join us for the Zoom class on Thursday. God bless your study of these 2 chapters. Thank you.